Thank you, Christopher. I don't know if this comes as a surprise to you, though perhaps it should. I am not the perfect husband. Maybe a perfect husband, just not the perfect husband. No, actually, I'm far, far, far from that. Regularly, I am doing things that are aggravating to Caroline, and sometimes it's not simply that I say or do the wrong thing. Rather, it is that I fail to say or do the right thing. If you don't understand that there's a difference between those two, you can see me for marital counseling this week. They're very different things. Now, sometimes I will do something or fail to do something, fail to say the right thing, fail to do the right thing, and we have to have one of those discussions. Some of you have had discussion. So we have sometimes a discussion. Other times I'll do something, fail to do the right, fail to say the right thing, and it's not that big of a deal, and so she'll pass it off by making some type of joke. And to share one of those jokes with you, let me give you some background. I have shared with you before how Caroline and I actually met through the internet. One of the ways that God used to bring us together was through a website called Match.com. Anyway, how that worked though, years ago, I was 29 years old. I'd been pastoring for a number of years. I was really consumed with the work of ministry, and there was no one that I was meeting at church, at the hospital, or at the funeral home, and so that's where I was spending all of my time. And at this point, internet dating sites were beginning to catch on in terms of popularity. And one day I was sitting at home at my desk and I saw on my homepage an ad for Match.com, and I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. And so I went on there, I created this profile, and a couple of days later, long story short, I get this email from this girl who's named Caroline, and the rest is history. And with all that as background, I will sometimes do something that is an aggravation to Caroline, or something that is fail to do the right thing, fail to say the right thing, or actually do the wrong thing, whatever it is. And so when this happens, Caroline will say this: "Why didn't I use eHarmony?" Obviously, of course, she's saying that in jest, but periodically we'll talk about not simply how we met, but what if we had not gone on the internet? What if we had one of us been on Match, the other eHarmony? Would God have somehow worked through other circumstances to bring us together? What would happen if it hadn't been for that and we had never met? How different would our lives be? How different would this world be? That we would have never come together, that we would have never gotten married, that we wouldn't have these 4 children. How different would everything be? And it's interesting sometimes to think those thoughts, how different circumstances would be if we had made different choices, if we'd made different decisions, if we'd gone to different places. It would be interesting if things were different. Or quite frankly, we wonder what it would be like if others would do things more in keeping with our preference, or more in keeping with our likes. Now, this morning we're going to conclude a series of messages with that thought in mind, called I Wish. What if God did things your way? And throughout these past number of weeks, what we've done is to think about how oftentimes we really do wish that the Father would do things more in keeping with our preferences, more in keeping with our desires, our dreams, and our aspirations. And as we've done so, we've been thinking through that question with this lens that we're looking at: how would things be different? How would things be different? As we conclude this series, though, I want to share with you an encouraging thought. Just as you have repeatedly throughout the course of your walk with the Lord longed for the Father to do things how you would like them, Jesus, God's Son, knows exactly what that thought is like. In fact, we have Jesus just prior to the crucifixion essentially saying that when, with reference to the crucifixion, he prayed to the Father, "Let this cup pass from me." Jesus knows what it's like to think to the Father, "I wish you would do things my way." Well, what if the Father had yielded to the humanity of the Son and the crucifixion had just passed by Jesus? What would the consequence of that desire have been? You see the answer to that in Matthew chapter 26. If you would look with me in your Bibles there today. Matthew chapter 26. We'll look at just 2 verses of Scripture, verses 39 and verse 42. Matthew 26, verse 39. The verse begins with a little stage setting there, and it describes how Jesus went a little farther, and this is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He fell on his face and prayed, saying, "O Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Down in verse 42, you essentially see a repetition of that thought. Again, a second time, Jesus went away and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." So what I'm suggesting to you is that Jesus understands what it is like to express the desire to the Father, "I wish you would do things more in keeping with how I would prefer them." But what if the Father had yielded to the humanity of the Son when he's essentially saying, I wish this cup, this crucifixion might pass by me? What would the consequence of that decision have been? Well, there's a couple of them that we see, and the first is this. Jesus' cup would become your cup. Jesus' cup would become your cup. Now, hopefully you're pretty familiar with what's going on in this passage, but so that we're on the same page, let's think in terms of broader context. It's the final night of Jesus' earthly life and ministry. He has begun this night celebrating, as all faithful Jews did, the Passover meal, and he did so with his disciples. At the conclusion of this observance, Jesus invites the disciples to go with him to the Garden of Gethsemane, where they're going to have a time of prayer. 11 of them go with Jesus, but one of them, you remember Judas, he doesn't go. Instead, he goes to meet up with the religious leaders and Roman soldiers so that he can complete the betrayal of Jesus that he has already negotiated. And so Jesus has gone into the garden there at Gethsemane. It's the final night of his earthly life and ministry, and Jesus goes there for this season of prayer. We're told as the chapter begin, or earlier in the chapter, that Jesus leaves 8 of the disciples at one spot, and then he takes those that he's absolutely closest to, Peter, James, and John, a bit further. And then away from them, he has this intimate moment with the Father where Jesus is just absolutely bearing his heart and soul to the Father in prayer. And in verse 37, we're told that Jesus began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. In verse 38, he says, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death." This begs a simple question. Why is Jesus experiencing such anguish? Why is he experiencing such sorrow? I mean, this is the last night of Jesus' earthly life and ministry. Shouldn't he be just recollecting and reminiscing with his disciples? Why is he so sorrowful? Why is he in such bitter anguish? Well, you understand that Jesus was God in human flesh. And as God in human flesh, Jesus understood what was going to take place. He understood what the hours ahead were going to hold for him. His divine knowledge led him to know that the crucifixion, that the cross awaited him. His knowledge led him to understand how he was going to be beaten, how he was going to go through this series of mock trials, how he was going to have this crown of thorns placed on his brow. He knew the pain that would be endured. But then, as one in human flesh, Jesus understood from personal experience what it's like to experience pain. And because he understood that, there was this desire within him to not have to experience it. So that we're on the same page here, I just want to talk for a brief moment about some basic Christian theology. It's difficult for us to kind of get our arms around this, but there's some basic facts that we need to understand. The first is this: God has always, eternally existed in a triune form. We believe that there is one God, eternally distinct in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. Not 3 gods, but a triune God. We believe that God has always existed this way, that there has never been a time when God has not existed as Father, Son, and Spirit. This means that Jesus has always existed. Jesus did not get his beginning at that first Christmas. What happened at that first Christmas is that the incarnation takes place. The word incarnate or incarnation literally means in flesh. At that point, we have God becoming flesh among us. What I want you to understand, though, is that Jesus was not at that point some hybrid mix, kind of half God and half man. Jesus was full humanity, he was fully man, while at the same time he was fully divine, retaining all the power, retaining all the knowledge, retaining all the understanding. So in Jesus you have the God-man, one that is at the same time fully God and one that is at the same time fully man. As God, as divinity, Jesus knew what was getting ready to happen. He knew the horrors that were getting ready to be experienced. But as man, Jesus understood from personal experience. Jesus had already experienced pain before. And so he knew how awful, how excruciating, how agonizing all of this would be. And with that on his mind and his heart, Jesus is baring his heart to the Father in prayer, now separated from everybody, not just the 8, but now Peter, James, and John. It's just he and his Father as he's speaking to his Father, and he says, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me." There's a few things I want you to notice about that statement, and the first has to do with the cup. When Jesus says, "If it's possible, let this cup pass from me." Well, what is the cup? Well, repeatedly in both Old and New Testaments, the cup is oftentimes used as a symbol of God's wrath at sin. In this particular instance, the cup is the reference to the crucifixion, to the cross, and everything that's a part of what Jesus was getting ready to experience. And about this, Jesus is saying, if it's possible, let this pass from me. Now, the second thing I'd have you notice is that when Jesus is bearing his soul to the Father and he's saying, if it's possible, let this pass from me, is this not effectively an I wish statement by Jesus? Is this not effectively Jesus saying, I wish that somehow, some way it were possible for me not to have to experience the cross, for me not to have nails driven into my hands, and for me not to have nails driven into my feet. That it is, in effect, an I wish statement by Jesus. But there's another thing I would have you note about this. Notice again, it says, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Grammatically, there is something that on the surface may not seem significant, but actually is important. When Jesus says, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, grammatically speaking, that is a first-class conditional statement. And I'm sure you're thinking, well, wonderful. I was thinking it was second class all the while. Again, on the surface, that may seem inconsequential. It may not have been something that's ever been a thought that you've entertained, but it is significant because first-class conditional statements refer to things that actually are possible. What I'm trying to say to you is that when Jesus is bearing his soul to the Father, when Jesus is saying, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, when Jesus says that, understand this, it was possible for the cup to pass. I want you to understand that the Father could have yielded to the humanity of the Son, and the cup would have passed from Jesus. When Jesus is saying, if there's some way possible, let this pass from me, Jesus didn't have to experience the cross. Jesus didn't have to die. The Father could have yielded to the humanity of the Son and said, in essence, fine, no Calvary. The cup would have passed from Jesus. But what would the consequence of that have been? Very simply, the cup would have passed from Jesus to you. Jesus' cup would have become your cup. You would stand before God as a sinner and you would have to personally pay for. You would have to personally accept the brunt of the consequences for your sins. You would have to be separated from God, not simply in this life, but at the end of your life, separated from God for eternity in a godless hell. You would remain separated from Him from all eternity. What I'm trying to say to you is that if the Father had yielded to the humanity of the Son, and when Jesus said, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, if the cup had passed from Jesus, it would have passed from Him and rested squarely in your hands. This past week, we had gone to the beach for a week of vacation, and we were down at Holden Beach. And there's not a whole lot down there, except there are just a couple of beach stores. And there was one in particular that I had taken the boys to several times. It has all sorts of towels and beach toys, but all sorts of other little trinkets as well. And Andrew and Philip, I let them get something. And what they were able to get, well, actually Nathan got something as well, but what Andrew and Philip got were these packs of Shocking gum. I don't know if you've ever seen those, but it looks like a pack of chewing gum, and it looks like there's a piece that's sticking out, but there's batteries inside so that when you pull on it, it shocks you. Moms don't buy those gifts, but good dads really do. Anyway, so Andrew and Philip have gotten this Shocking gum, and so they are so excited to get back to the house because not only is Nathan and Caroline there, but so too are her parents, her brother and his wife, and their 2 kids. And so they want to get back and offer everybody a piece of gum. And so they get back, and of course the adults understand what's going on. You pull on this, you get shocked. And so grudgingly but dutifully, everybody takes their turn. They pull on the gum, and everybody gets a little shot of electricity. Now, what stinks about a trick like that is that once you've done it, even if you can trick somebody into pulling it, once they've done it, they're not going to do it again. If they got any sense, right? And so it's kind of a one and done type trick. But, here I am with a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old. They're wanting to, hey, pull it again, pull it again, pull it again. And so nobody is doing this. So a couple of days pass, and we're sitting out on the deck, and Philip has gone inside, and he comes out with his Shocking gum. And he goes over to Caroline's brother, whose name is Todd, and he says, Todd, won't you pull it? When Todd tells Big Phil, I'm not going to pull it. And he said, yeah, you pull it. And so then Todd does this. He acts like he's pulling on it and then tells Big Phil, the batteries must be dead. It doesn't work. And Philip protests. He said, no, it works. And Todd's, he's acting like he's pulling on it. He keeps doing this. And no, it's not doing anything. This must be broken. Here, you try it. And so now Big Phil gets this back in his hand, and he yanks on it, and what does he do? The batteries were not dead, and Philip gets a shock. As his father, flesh of my flesh, what do? I laugh hysterically. It was the funniest thing I saw all week. I thought it was absolutely hysterical. But Philip is in tears, and it's not so much tears because he's hurting, but it's tears of anger and frustration. This is not how it was supposed to be. Todd was supposed to get this, but I got it. How it was supposed to work is that Todd was supposed to and seemed to be intent on experiencing this, but instead Philip got the full brunt of it. Far worse than getting shocked by a little trinket toy pack of fake gum is the consequence if Jesus had let us experience the full brunt for our sin. If he had passed it back to us, if he'd passed it back to you, if he'd passed it back to me, listen, we would experience the full fury of the wrath of God on our sin. Instead of him taking that and bearing it on himself, you would have personally experienced the full brunt of it. What I'm trying to say to you is that if the Father had yielded to the humanity of the Son when Jesus said, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. If the Father had said, fine, no Calvary, the cup would have passed from Jesus, and it would have gone straight back to you. If Jesus didn't take that for you, you would take the full brunt of it yourself. But there's another consequence that we see that's going on here, and that's this. If the Father had said, fine, no Calvary, if the cup were to pass from Jesus, very simply stated, the consequence would be this: the Father's will would have gone unfulfilled. The Father's will would have gone unfulfilled. This whole idea of Jesus being at the same time fully God and fully man, I'll be honest with you, that's a tough thought to get our arms around because there's nothing in our life that is an equivalent thought. That's a difficult thought to grasp. Fully God and fully man at the same time. We don't understand that very well, but we do understand that whole idea of being fully human because we are fully human. And so one of the things that is true of us because we're human is that in the course of life, we experience pain. We know what it's like to physically hurt, to emotionally hurt. We know what it's like from personal experience to feel humiliation, to feel real suffering and real pain. Because we have experienced that, we know this. If there is suffering, if there is pain in the future, whether physical or emotional, relational, if there is the prospect of pain in our future, what do we want to do? We want to avoid it at all cost. If there's pain in our future, we want to avoid it at all cost. And so when we say, yes, we have difficulty understanding this whole idea of Jesus being fully God and fully man at the same time, we can understand, though, that that full humanity side of him understood what pain was like, and because of that, sought to avoid it if at all possible. And so what then you see Jesus experiencing is this tension between the divinity and the humanity. As God, he knows what is necessary and what must happen. As a human, he knows that's awful. And I wish somehow it was possible to avoid it. And so he, in agony, in anguish, expresses that tension to the Father. But as he does so, both in verse 39 and then in verse 42, he concludes with similar thoughts. He says, not as I will, but as you will. And then he says, your will be done. You know, fortunately, we have among our 4 children very healthy kids. And there have been a few earaches, some strep throat, but nothing of any consequence. That being said, they have gone to the doctor a number of times throughout the course of their lives. But most of those visits have been well visits, like for annual checkups and that type of thing. And you're aware of the fact that especially among young children, when they go for those well visits, a lot of times there's immunizations that are part of that. They have to get shots. Well, little kids don't have to be Einsteins to understand that shots hurt, and they don't like them, right? Your kids didn't like them. You didn't like them when you were little. I didn't like them when I was little. My kids don't like them as well. And so they have come to understand, though, that these annual visits typically involve an immunization. Well, this past March, Philip he turned 4. In the weeks leading up to it, I had the 3 boys with me in the van. We were going somewhere one afternoon, and Philip was talking about his birthday and how he's getting ready to have a birthday and how he's going to be turning 4 and blah, 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 blah. Well, Andrew, upon hearing this, says to him, Philip, you're going to go to the doctor and you're going to get a shot. Happy birthday. Well, yes, it wasn't a nice thought, but what Andrew said to him was the truth. Because right after he turned 4, he had to go to the doctor, and as part of that visit, he was going to be getting a shot. But when Andrew was telling him this, Philip all of a sudden dawned on him that Andrew was telling him the truth. And so as it was approaching the day for Philip to go to the doctor, and he knew when that appointment was, and the day of that appointment, Philip was just in anguish about going with his mom to the doctor that day. Why? Because he knew that a shot was in his future. He knew he was going to get that. You see, it's one thing to stumble into pain. For example, it's one thing to go to the doctor and him say, oh, by the way, you need to get a tetanus shot. It's another thing, though, before you even get there to know, I'm going to the doctor and I'm going to get a shot. It's different, isn't it? It makes it far worse, not stumbling into an experience of pain, but rather knowing beforehand you're going to experience it. Well, what's going on here with Jesus? Jesus, as God in human flesh, knows what is getting ready to happen. Jesus understands what this cup represents. He understands that it's going to involve this series of mock trials and this arrest. He understands that it's going to involve an excruciating beating, how it's going to involve him being stripped naked for everyone to see. He knows and understands that it's going to involve him carrying the cross itself, the instrument of execution, up a hill. Jesus understands that it's going to involve a crown of thorns being pushed into his brow. Jesus understands and knows in his divine knowledge that what he's going to be experiencing is having himself laid on a cross and then have nails driven into his hands and driven into his feet, then raised up and dropped into a hole, and for hours have to in excruciating pain try to raise up just to get a breath. And it's going to be like that for hours until you're just so weak you can't raise up anymore. And finally, you die of suffocation. Jesus knew beforehand that all that was going to be involved. Listen, Philip was in tears at the thought that a shot that he knew a shot was going to be involved. But Jesus knew all of that stuff was going to be involved. Yet he said, in spite of that, knowing this, he said, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. But then he concludes by saying, not what I will, not what my humanity desires, but what you, Father, in your perfect will desire. I will intentionally yield, yield myself to that. I said earlier, though, that Jesus did not have to die. The Father could have yielded to the request of the humanity of the Son and said, fine, no Calvary. The cup would have passed from him, but what would that consequence have been? Well, you understand that the cup of suffering passing from Jesus, that was not the Father's will. What then was the Father's will? Well, we discover what the Father's will is in 1 Peter 3, verse 18, where we're told, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, and here it is, that he might bring us to God. What was the Father's will? That he might bring us, that he might bring you to God. Jesus is there in the garden in agony and anguish, saying, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. I know how horrible it is. I know what pain is like, and if it's all possible, I want to avoid it. But I want to yield to your will, because it's your will to bring somebody like a Michael, somebody like you, unto yourself. If the Father had yielded to the humanity of the Son, the Father's will would have gone unfulfilled. You would have never been brought to God. You would have never been able to know personally the God who made you. You would have never been able to experience a relationship with a God that loves you. You would have never been able to go through life with the comfort of his guidance. You would have never gone through life with the understanding that he has expectations of you, that if you'll meet those, you'll experience his blessing. You would have never experienced the benefit of his loving correction. You would have never been able to stand at the graveside of a loved one with the comforting thought in your mind, I'll see them one day again. And most importantly, for you, there would never be a day when your life is over that you stand before the Lord in his heaven and he says, well done, good and faithful servant, enter thou into the joy of the Lord. None of that would have ever been experienced. But you know what? That was the Father's will. The Father's will was to bring me, to bring you to him. And so Jesus intentionally, willingly said, I will submit to that. Here I am, the Lamb ready to be slaughtered. You know, so many times in the course of our walks with God, we have wished that God would do things differently, that he would do things more in keeping with our preferences and in keeping with our desires for personal comfort. Jesus understands what that is like when he said, let this cup pass from me. But the good news is Jesus submitted himself to the Father's plan and the cup didn't pass from him. That cup of suffering didn't become your cup of suffering. The Father's desire to bring you to him, that became an actual possibility for me and for you. My question for you very simply this morning is this. Jesus did all of this for you. The question is, have you received it? Have you accepted it? Have you enabled the work that he did on the cross to bring you to the Father? If not, today can be your day. Won't you bow your heads with me?